So let's start. So welcome again, and now we will have the presentation by Professor Christian Høgel, the Georgian-Byzantine literary interaction in the 11th century. So please, the floor is yours, Christian.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karina. Thank you for inviting me for this, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about things I work on and that I well, you could say care about, because I think it's of importance and is not sufficiently known or studied, or well, there's not enough attention on this specific area, and I will be trying to sort of also discuss perhaps even reasons why, but at least discuss how it should, I think, or how it could become more widely known or widely included into other studies. It's my work is on Byzantine literature mainly, but I've been working very much on translations from other languages into Greek, so from Arabic into Greek, and from then also Georgian into Greek, and that is what I'll be talking about. And I'm putting special emphasis on the 11th century because that's a period of special interest in the question of translations from Georgian into Greek, but certainly also from Greek into Georgian, and that's why I call it interaction. But I think I call it interaction also because there is more interaction both ways than would normally be presented, I think, again, speaking of how scholarship will deal with this. So these were just words of beginning. And then I should also say that, of course, it is a very special moment to be speaking about Georgian matters these days with these political demonstrations and very hard issues on stage or being played out and being discussed in very harsh ways in Georgia at the moment. I really hope for the best of that, for that process. I feel sort of taking you back into a past time and thinking, well, there are really hard issues just at the moment. I will nevertheless continue. I will share my screen, which is basically showing my PowerPoint. It should come up now. If there's a problem, please let me know. I think it's full screen now. And yeah. So I'm based at Lund. That is quite recently, and so happy to be here, working from Sweden. And this is a work that I do already starting in a Swedish context because I'm part of a project. You'll see the logo soon of the so-called Retracing Connections project with our PI Ingela Nilsson in Uppsala. So let me see if I can get the screen. Yeah. So just to make sure that everybody is aware what region we're speaking of, it's medieval Georgia. This is a map trying to say more or less what was included in some kind of kingdom of Georgia, because there were many, and there were many separate parts also that could be called Georgians. So it's sort of the dark green, of course, includes then in the upper left corner modern Georgia, but also south of that some parts of modern Turkey, large parts of Armenia, which are to the right, and then again more to the right, Azerbaijan. Also parts of this were included into medieval Georgian kingdoms. Let me see. Georgian literature, I'm just now giving you a very brief overlook and then diving more and more into the 11th century and even into the translation techniques and questions arising from that, which I think all will demonstrate how Georgian Byzantine interaction in literary terms is of interest. So Georgian literature and the Georgian writing starts basically with Christianity, with a lot of translations, and that is what I will be speaking about here, and not so much the compositions that come out of the Georgian literature. I'm just mentioning some important things. The life of Nino, which is in fact as it is transmitted to us, part of the Georgian Chronicle, the Gathlitz Trobrebra, which is a sort of compilation of various work, but telling the Christianization of Georgia and the early history of Christian Georgia. Georgian history, of course, goes much further back, even from a Greek perspective, known as Kolchis and Medea and other people were, of course, Georgians. But here is the starting point of Georgian writing. One important thing, if we look at the map of Georgia around 1000, which is the map here, and that is, of course, just looking at the map shows you the complication of this area in political terms. We have several entities. The line going from the upper left corners downwards to the right is, of course, the Caucasian ridge, separating also political entities. But the gray part is what was mainly the main parts of what we could call Georgia at this point. Well, Abkhazia was soon became part of this same kingdom. Abkhazia, so to the north or northwest of this gray area, and soon after this also the parts east of this, so including what is here Tiflis, so Tbilisi and Kakheti and other areas to the east. This is the moment, this is just before the moment, normally we say in 1008, the year 1008, that the Georgian kingdom was united into one kingdom. But we also see that to the left, also the west, is the Byzantine Empire. So that is the bordering area. In this area, we have especially Georgians and Armenians, of course, but also lots of other groups, nations, ethnic groups, in what could be in Byzantine terms called areas, border areas, but in its own right, of course, its own both nations and kingdoms, and therefore political entities. I've placed the Oshki Cathedral, more or less, I think correctly, on the map, just to indicate that this is one important Georgian center of learning and literary writing, literary production at this moment, at the end of the 10th century. It is actually now, through the research by Ilguca Khintibidze, professor in Tbilisi, clear that this was a major channel also of important text that came to the translators that I'll be talking about, the Georgian translators, which are normally mostly spoken of as translators from Greek into Georgian. The history of Georgian writing, as I said, has a lot of translations, and the areas of translation were in many ways, you could say, included or parts of the Byzantine Empire. But the moment I'm talking about is a moment of reorientation from 10th, 11th century, where you could say the Georgian translation movement, I think we could call it such, became even more closely related to the Byzantine literary sphere. Here's an image of what the Oshki Cathedral looks like today. And this is the historical moment. I'm just bringing up two kings, which are, of course, of special importance, central importance for understanding this period. David III Kuropalatis, that is a Byzantine name of honor, was king of this the gray area, but what his interaction with the Byzantine Empire was important, because he in 976 supported the newly elected or newly newly crowned emperor, Byzantine Emperor Basil II. He supported him in against a claimant to the throne, Bardos Skleros, and so supported him by sending simply an army. And for this, he was given large pieces of you could say Byzantine territory to include in the area of the Georgian kingdom, but also his General Tornike or John Tornike, Ioannis Tornike, Tornike, or various versions of his name, was heavily rewarded in terms of money, but also in terms of getting the right to establish a monastery on Mount Athos, so in modern northern Greece. The monastery also today called the Iviron monastery, and Iviron meaning the Georgian, or the Georgians, the monastery of the Georgians. So his this political, you could say, importance of Georgians playing a role in supporting a Byzantine emperor who was then to have a reign of almost 50 years, was very important in establishing a group of not only learned, but you could say highly intellectual and very productive Georgians in a more or less newly established area of monasticism, so Mount Athos. This is not the only place where where Georgians were placed within the Byzantine realm. I'll show you a map soon, but this is the one important thing in changing, you could say, the position of Georgians within a Byzantine literary context. So Bagrat III, which was his adoptive son, then was the king that made it possible to sort of unite the Georgian kingdom soon after. Here is a map. You could say it's a map of 2 cities and 4 mountains or mountain areas. Jerusalem was very early, together with Mount Sinai, centers of Georgian literary production. But in the period I'm talking about, so the 10th, 11th century, these areas were, first of all, no longer part of the Byzantine Empire, which in a sense didn't change that much because you could still be there, you could still be active and productive there, and the monasteries continue being productive there. But the main translators of this period, and especially those that we know by name, and there, of course, there's a question of how we are to the various active persons here in saying, oh, well, no, it's these places we're paying attention to. But at least those that we know of were on these places I'm pointed out with the other circles. So Mount Athos, as I already mentioned, in northwestern Greece, but also Mount Olympus, which even before this period was had also Georgians residing there together with other monastic communities. And this kind of blended monastic community area is the same that we have in the area that I've here encircled called the Wondrous Mountain. Actually, at this point, it was more called the Black Mountain, but it's southwest of Antioch. That we have these monastic areas. Again, you could say it resembles things that we could also point out in Jerusalem and Mount Sinai, but that various communities of various languages more or less are active at the same place, and we must imagine some kind of interaction. These questions about the interaction between then, for example, Georgian, Armenian, Syriac, even Slavonic when speaking of Mount Athos, possibly even other languages, Arabic, of course, also, especially if we're going further south, but also in Antioch, this kind of question of what kind of interaction did actually take place, what kind of, well, transfer of ideas, but also perhaps transfer of materials. The manuscripts could have gone from one place to the other once somebody had worked with the manuscript, translated it, or whatever they needed for it. It could have gone to other monastic groups doing new things with it in other languages. These were enormously productive areas of translation, as I say, very much, we could say, from what had been the main or the dominant languages in late antiquity, like Greek, but also crisscross on all sorts of directions of translation. So a very complicated image of various languages being translated back and forth. Constantinople is also encircled here, and yet it's the presence there is, or the activities there are not as, or we do not have attested material in the same degree from that area, but we do have some. But these are the you could say the most active in the 11th century are certainly centers of translation between Greek and Georgian are Mount Athos and the Black Mountain, or the Wondrous Mountain here near Antioch. Here again, of course, one should remember that it's just exactly in this 11th century that Antioch is under Byzantine rule from late 10th to late 11th century. It's under Byzantine rule for about a century, then becoming parts of others, and then soon being part of Crusader states. So I'm highlighting three Georgian translators working at this point. Euthymius the Athonite, whom I will be speaking almost exclusively about soon, but I'll just mention also Georgi the Athonite, and since his successor at Mount Athos, but then soon after conflicts also in Mount Athos, in other places, and in many ways a traveling person, but so was Euthymius, and then Ephraim Tsire being permanently or mostly based around the Black Mountain near Antioch. These three, we could say, are in a sequence, both in the way that they are clearly working within a Byzantine idea of what translations should look like. Now that can be bended in many ways, and could be one could state that and mean many things by it. And I will show you with Euthymius how that meant many things. Euthymius was the only one of these that we know of who translated both ways. So he translated a lot of material from Greek into Georgian, but then at least two texts the other way, from Georgian into Greek. The others worked exclusively, as far as we know, from Greek into Georgian. But they also worked in a sense, at least Ephraim clearly worked in a sense, as a corrector, you could say, or as a sort of saying, well, Euthymius had done a wonderful job in translating a lot of material. It's less biblical and much more, it's all, first of all, religious text. Well, all that is translated from Greek into Georgian is certainly. It's patristics, it's hagiography, it's commentaries, and it's homilies and such. But Ephraim is in a sense saying we need to correct a bit on Euthymius because he had a sort of a freestyle in the way he translates it, and you will soon see what he meant by that, or at least how we can see that Ephraim was definitely right in asserting this. So Euthymius the Athonite, this is the person I'll be talking about. He was active from the 970s at Mount Athos. So from an early age, we don't know exactly when he came. And this is at the moment when the monastery, which you see in the upper right corner, was established by the help of this Tornike I mentioned before. That required money, of course. That was part of the payment that Basil II, the Byzantine emperor, had provided them with, but also the right to be there at all, and also of course, the right persons. So Tornike himself was, at least became a monk and probably a learned person, but he soon attracted also Euthymius, also his father, also others to this monastery. And as you see, Euthymius became abbot actually in two periods, but this is the important one from 1005 to 1019. Then he retired as abbot because he wanted to dedicate more time to his translation activities. What is interesting about Efthymius' background is that he was probably a royal hostage, meaning that he was probably sent to Constantinople at a very young age. So before this establishing of the Iviron monastery, as part of a political treatise or agreement between the Byzantines and the Georgians. And so it was a normal thing when you did this, that in order to make sure that agreement was kept, you would send some people as well hostages, but in the sense that they would lead nice lives at the other court, of course, on the conditions that the treatise or the agreement was kept. If you didn't keep up that, you could fear at least that your beloved ones, or at least your fellow Georgians or Greeks, could be suffering at the other place because the political agreement was not kept. That is probably how he learned his good Greek. He must have acquired a good Greek learning, training, schooling that must have happened at Constantinople. And there are stories, we have lives of him, but they are partly legendary. But they also tell about his father coming to Constantinople and being sad about that Efthymius seemed to have lost all his Georgian. In any case, the discussion of language is part of the presentation, also in the lives of Efthymius, this question about two languages. What happens then is that these people become part of a Georgian community, of course, in Mount Athos, but they also become some kind of new, intellectual or aristocratic milieu, having a great influence. And we see that, you could see both through the question of how much they acquire in terms of the monastery and so on, but also in terms of production of texts. And that is both Georgian texts, which are normally then at least sent or meant to be sent to Georgia, but also Greek texts. And that is not only the Greek texts they themselves produced, but also other texts like hagiography, metaphrastic hagiography, produced at the Iviron monastery. So Greek texts, recently produced Greek texts. There's a whole question of the interaction there, which we don't yet know enough about. Why are these Georgians with, of course, good Greek scribes then producing Greek manuscripts? There is some kind of idea that they are producing also text or manuscripts, perhaps, for Greek monastic communities. We also later see that Georgians play important roles in politics. Some people become politically problematic because they are seen as possible contenders to the throne. There are people who are in other ways involved in central Constantinopolitan politics. But in terms of Efthymius's activities, which are clearly, and that we know also from a colophon written by his father, who proudly then lists all the things that Efthymius translated, most of his time must have been dedicated simply to translating. He translated so much that it is clear that that was his main activity. So most of this was, as I said, from Greek into Georgian. That is Greek patristics, Greek hagiography, including the very newly composed so-called metaphrastic texts, and so on. There's a whole question about that, how he acquired that, where Simeon Metaphrastus, the producer of the metaphrastic text, was, because it is almost at the same moment that he is producing these. And here also this Simeon Metaphrastus fell into disfavor at the court. So there's a possible even collaboration possible at this point. I won't be speaking much about this. This is a big, has a lot of, especially Georgian scholarship has gone into looking at these translations, of which we have numerous copies. And again, much of this, of course, is part of the medieval, the large medieval Georgian material we have. But the interesting thing is that much of this study has more or less produced the same kind of collected image of what Euthymius did when translating as the studies on the text that he translated the other way, which I'll be talking more about here. So the Georgian Greek translations. And here there are two texts, also as seen from listing in colophons. One is the Life of Theodore of Edessa, which is a fascinating story and is the main object of study for this Retracing Connections project, which I'm part of. And there's a team, I'm sort of on the side, there's a team mainly directed by Professor Stratis Papaioannou, who's working on editing the Greek text, but also the various bits that we have of earlier versions, especially the Georgian part that we have as a, we could say, a section of the Life of Theodore of Edessa. But this text is enormously complicated, and large parts of it have no original material before the text produced by Euthymius, and it may be that it is simply his own composition, so large parts of this. The other text, which is probably more known, but is still being studied, is the story of Bartolom and Joasaph, and this is the one I will be talking about mostly from now on, to show what kind of work that Euthymius was doing on this text, but also what kind of importance it had in a much larger image of text coming from the East, we could say, in this case, actually from India, and arriving through Georgian into Greek, and then also, we could say, through a Georgian or Euthymius's attempt to make this text work in a new context. So what is this story of Bartolom and Joasaph? Yeah, this is summing up of what we could say about Euthymius's working method. So when translating from Greek into Georgian, so the many texts, the hagiography and patristics, he is to some degree epitomizing, so cutting down on the material. He's very much paraphrasing and explaining, and he's in a sense using simple language. I mean, it is, especially if you compare it to the translations the other way. You'll see this in a soon. But the main idea you get out of this is he's really making sure that people at the other end would understand this, would have a chance to get into the spirit of the text. And for this purpose, he also produced, as is the case of so many Georgian manuscripts or Georgian translations at the point, produced these quite long, in some cases very long, colophon text to explain the use and the intention behind the text. Translating the other way from Georgian to Greek, there's a lot of expanding going on. So here you could see the difference between the two. And the way that he is expanding the original Georgian text is by inserting long passages from well-known Greek texts, from patristics, from hagiography, actually from the text that he would himself be also translating the other way into Georgian. So there's a lot of, you could say, mixing of processes, at least possible, behind this. You translate a text from Greek into Georgian, and as you translate, you might be thinking, oh, this is a lovely passage. And by the way, I'm also translating this other text from Georgian to Greek. That passage could actually fit in there and be a good way of fleshing out, making more Byzantine the text that I have in Georgian. So this is what one would say, or I would say, and others have said also, is the main characteristic here. Euthymius is trying to make this recognizable in the Byzantine sphere. So including things that would be known to a Byzantine reader and audience, and therefore becoming, in a sense, you could say, acceptable. And why should it be acceptable? What is you will see soon what the problem is. It was actually discovered long time ago, end of the 19th century, that we have the Balaam and Yosef story is actually a Buddhist story. That was already earlier than in the late 19th century. Somebody had said that this story of Balaam and Yosef, or Josaphat, or other versions of the young prince's name in the story, resembles so much this Buddhist tale coming out of India that we also know then from Chinese, Japanese, Turkish, all sorts of sources. That is surprising. And then by hard work of philologists, it was suddenly discovered that this is no coincidence. It's not even just a transfer of a story known or such. No, it's a sequence of translations that led to this story becoming known in the West. So the Balaam character is not really, there's no real parallel in the Sanskrit versions, because it's primarily the early part of the story that is Buddhist. But the young prince, who is the other main character, the other protagonist of the story, the Josaphat character, is actually a sort of gradual misrepresentation or translation by small mistakes or small adjustments of the Buddha name. So you see that the original Bodhisattva becomes Buddhasv in Arabic, and then probably wrongly written with 2 dots instead of 1 dot below the first character, and becoming Yudasav, then Yudasaf, Yoasaf, Yosaphat, in various ways, trying perhaps to make it resemble Old Testament names, but in any case, not bringing it far away from the original. And as you see, so it's a gradual sort of change of the name. As you also see, the religion on the way also changed. So in the Pahlavi version, it became a Manichaean text. In the Arabic, it was a Muslim Shiite Islamic story, we could say, and then in the Georgian it becomes a Christian text, and in Greek it becomes what I would still say is what I would call a saint's life by the process of rewriting, and then it traveled on to a number of Western languages. But this is, of course, in a sense, saying Buddhist literature is normally represented in this way. This is a normal map of how Buddhist literature spread, but in a sense, this is misrepresenting the actual spread, because there was a westward journey of this Buddhist text as well. And here it becomes important to see what this we could call a Silk Road literature. And the Balaam and Yosef story is certainly not the only one. And this is a cross simplification of the process, because of course much of this was translated in various directions, in several goes, and in backwards translations as well. The Greek becoming later translated into Arabic and so on. So you have I'm just showing that there is a westward journey also, like in the eastward on north, south, east, and so on journey is shown on the original map of Buddhist literature. So the story, and this is only the beginning of the story of the Balaam story, you may know it, is the story of a king who wants a son and finally gets one, but there is also some kind of religion in the country, and that depends on which version of the story we're speaking about. In the Georgian version, of course, it's then Christianity that is unwanted, but the son that is born to him gets the prediction at the birth, or soon after the birth, that he will not attain the glory of this world if he sees the sorrows of this world. Then he will become he will convert to this unwanted religion. So in an attempt from the king to make the son not convert to this unwanted religion, he locks him up in a castle, making sure that everyone is happy, so that the sun doesn't see the sorrows of the world, and nobody's ill. If there's any kind of problem, these people will be taken away. And soon the problem arises that this all works, but the young prince grows up, and he sort of gets an idea that there is a world outside, and asks his father, "Could I get to see the world?" And that, of course, is what the father feared and will not let him. But the son insists, and then at the end he is allowed one ride around the city, and that ride is a success, but only because the father has orchestrated the outside world to look like the castle. Everybody's happy, nobody's ill, so everything works fine for the ride. The son doesn't see anything. He's allowed another ride because the first one worked, and then suddenly he sees a blind and a handicapped person. This is from a Greek manuscript. You see the Greek at the bottom, but actually, if you look at the top, you'll see that somebody has been writing an Old French translation into the Greek manuscript. And here you see the prince on the white horse, seeing these two persons in the streets, and then asking his courtiers, "But what's wrong with these people?" And then they have a hard time explaining, well, these are people who are suffering. It won't get better, and they will die at the end at some point, and so on. So the prince is suddenly confronted with the evils of the world. You could say gets depressed, and the only solution for the father is to find a teacher, and this is the Barlam person who's then introduced, and he, of course, comes with the religion that the father didn't want, and the son converts, and so on. So that's the continuation of the story. And this is, I think, the right moment to say why this story would be uncommon to a Byzantine audience. I think there are two things that are really surprising and would never have appeared in any kind of Greek text, I would say, before this moment. And that is a depressed teenager. I haven't encountered it in other places. So sort of having this kind of insisting demand towards his father. And then also the story of a slow conversion, because in a sense, from the moment of this depression and then on to the question to the moment that he then receives the true religion from his teacher is a long way. So it's a slow conversion. This, I think, Efthymios had to sort of deal with and think of how to make work for a Byzantine audience. Here you see some images from other, you can see from the Arabic and from a German, of the wonderful embedded tales included in the story. That is, you could say, an Indian characteristic. Many of these stories come with numerous embedded tales, and I'm of course skipping this in my very short summary of the story. So the Balavariani, as the text is normally referred to in Georgian, became the Barlamaniosa through Efthymios' intervention. But what did he do? Well, if you look at the new edition of the Greek text, you will see that there is an apparatus fontium. That is, where did Efthymios take his material from? And then there's a Fortwirkung, so things that have been reusing this text later on. Actually, the edition has some mistakes, because much of the Fortwirkung is actually also sources of Efthymios. If we take this section, this is you could say a random page I take out of the edition. Everything that is underlined in red is more or less a direct translation of the Georgian text. It is enough that it is so direct that you could actually say this sentence is this sentence, and so on, perhaps. And that is what I would call a close and direct translation. I'll return to this in a second. But what you see in bold writing or with is biblical additions, and what you see underlined with purple are texts from patristics, but especially from hagiography. So this is all things that were added, but from other sources by Efthymius. And the rest, the things that are not underlined and not in bold, are the things that Efthymius then added to make this all cohere into one text. But as you see, this is really a patch. It's a mosaic, I would call it, of various text types that have been combined into one text. So one could say, and this is one way of sort of collectively saying what is then Efthymius's Barlaam. Well, it's the Georgian Balavariani as the narrative backbone, but then a lot of Greek hagiography has been inserted, especially from the metaphrastic texts. And this concerns especially stock scenes, sort of scenes that would come up in much hagiography. So pagan sacrifices that would come up because emperors or somebody else than the saint, of course, would be pagan. Ascetic practice, of course. Emotional descriptions, so scenes of great emotion, like conversion, which comes up in various places in Efthymius's text, with borrowings from Greek hagiography, but also from Greek patristics, and especially there's one large section which is actually more or less a direct copy of a so-called Apology of Aristides, which is then Barlaam's long speech about what Christianity is. So this is a combined text. Can we call it a translation? I think we can, but it's a very inventive translation. Let's call it so. Here I take, again, a random passage, breaking it down into 10 sayings. It's a dialogue, as you see, between Abenes, that's the king, the father of Joasaph, and a courtier. So they have a dialogue. This is basically stating the things that the courtier is saying to the king. He's saying, beware of your enemies, you are too angry, you're a too angry person. And then he goes on to tell him what anger leads to. He says, justice depends on wisdom and understanding. So the king asks what has happened, part of the dialogue. Then there's a saying about, you could say, sort of philosophical saying. That's the courtier trying to explain to the king how do you distinguish between things instead of being just angry. You have to distinguish between what is and what is not. I did myself, and then I ceased being blind, the courtier says. And then comes here a section that is completely rewritten by Efthymius, so therefore I put it in as, things that, in the Balavariani, there comes a section about the worries of the wealthy, a theme that comes up in several goes, and Efthymius sort of avoids this, and he instead inserts a passage on preparing for the heavenly fight, sort of coming out of one specific saint's life. But again, people become attached, in fact, prisoners, the courtier says, do not go that way, king, nothing is stable, the world is evil, the saint feels no envy, gains no new family. And it all doesn't work, the king is still angry. These 10 sections, if you look at them, all work on the basic of these 4 sort of translation or rewriting principles. So either you have close translation, which is what I put up in the beginning, saying, okay, there are sections that are sort of, you could say this sentence is this sentence. But then there are added excerpts. That was what I showed with underlining. Then there are completely new text passages. The sample page I had earlier did not include much of that. And then there are, but there are sections both much more. And then there's the 4th sort of reworking method is the parallel of a single theme. I'll show you in a second what that means. So if we go back to the passage I just showed you, you can see CT means close translation. There are sections of close translation with some added bits from patristics or from hagiography. Then there's section 5, which is very special. And then there are this parallel of single themes. You see 3 of them towards the end, and I'll show you what I mean by this. So if we take here an example of a close translation, and then with added excerpts. You see that what is in, I've sort of framed in yellow are the sections that are really the same in Georgian on the left and Greek on the right. And of course, it is neither of them are in original. I show you in Greek, because in English, because that makes it possible to make easy comparison. So I'm presenting to you this basically in translation. But you see there are things there that are clearly parallel in terms of the yellow spots. But the rest almost in the Greek version is in bold, because it's taken out of one single life, Greek life, the life of Menas, of Saint Menas. So basically, this culture, the whole description of him becomes completely, well, Saint Menas. He is Saint Menas suddenly arriving into this story through all these borrowings. So this is what Euthymius does to make this culture a recognizable person, you could say, in a Byzantine context. Here again, we have another example of what I would call close translation. You have a clear sort of parallels in terms of words. I'm just pointing out the words to you. Here is a section again where you can say, okay, these things are parallel. You can easily see where sections sort of come from the original into the new version on the right. But then you see that this section about the fool in the middle of the text to the left, the fool imagines the real thing to be unreal, has become slightly rephrased. The foolish have decided to despise the things that are as though they were not, and to cleave and cling to things that are not as though they were. I would say, okay, we're still into the same idea, basically. But then comes some kind of philosophical addition. So one who has never tasted the sweetness of the things that are will not be able to understand the nature of the things that are not. And never having understood them, how shall he despise them? This is Euthymius's addition, it seems, unless, of course, and we never know with this, intermediate versions had this as well. But there are many sections where we have these kinds of additions that try to, well, either to spin off new ideas or to make it cohere better with the following thing. But at least here is something that was not in our Georgian original. But the thing, what I find interesting here is these parallel of single theme. So there are these three sections where you could say, well, what's actually going on here? Because if you look at like this section, you would read on the left, the Georgian text and say, well, when I get to here, I completely lose any kind of parallel on the right in terms of, well, I don't see the same words coming or the same ideas coming up in the New Greek version. And you could simply say, okay, the whole thing is just rewritten or a new text by Euthymius. But then you see, well, this idea about the prisoner has in some, you could, I mean, I now claim, at least from the recurrence of this phenomenon, has at least produced the idea of captivity, which of course is basically the same in the Greek text, somewhere in there, but the whole argument is completely different. And this phenomenon we see in several places, because again, here is a section where what the Georgian text is actually saying is that things pass. Nothing is stable. You see, it goes with today something is the case, tomorrow something else is the case. Today somebody is a king and tomorrow he's a slave. And then the yellow section, today it causes him to stretch out his hand to give, and tomorrow it makes him stretch out his hand to beg. And this is the only thing that is then parallel in the Greek version, is that just this, its riches is poverty. So here it's much more a question of contrasting things and saying that being rich is actually being poor in another way. So not making the same, having the same argument as the Georgian original about the time frame. The time makes things pass. No, it's an internal contradiction. Riches is poverty. But this is the only thing that is parallel. So you see, what happens here is basically that if Demon starts reading this, that's my guess. He starts reading this and says, this passage I cannot use. It doesn't work. I have to think of something completely new. But then either he likes the idea that riches is poverty, or it simply clings to his mind, and then he produces a new text that has this feature still included. So what one could think is, he sees a Greek text, and he looks at it and produces his own surrounding passage, you could say. Here's another example of the same. You see that there's a very clear parallel between certain things until down to the passage that we come to, and there it's something about friends and brothers. In the Georgian versions, they have turned into bitter enemies. This is why I have quitted the company and embarked on the quest for peace. And here also on the right, but from my former friends and brethren, I've got me away far off and lodged in the wilderness, waiting for the God who saves me from faintness of spirit and from the stormy tempest. Well, you could claim perhaps peace is still included, but there's clearly, apart from the biblical quotation, there's clearly a kind of rewriting included. So these are the four things I'm claiming that Efthymius works on. Close translation. I mean, there are still parts that are really keeping close. And of course, one could claim that perhaps he produced this first, that he went through the Georgian text, perhaps not skipping things, but actually producing a close translation of the whole thing, and then rewriting parts afterwards on the basis of these three working methods that I'm talking about: added excerpts, completely new text, and this parallel of a single theme, which is then, in a sense, a completely new text, but with one thing still in there from the original. So this is just an attempt to show you could say, the enormous amount of energy and work that went into Efthymius's translations from Georgian into Greek. I'm claiming that his concern was to make the text work in a new context, to make it recognizable, to de-foreignize, you could say, certain sections, and to, well, retain the story that he thought was important, including all the embedded stories, and making it more likely that the audience would recognize and like the text. I believe very much producing, one could say, a very long, well, hagiographical novel, we could perhaps call it, but I would still call it a saint's life. And we have other hagiographical novels from this period in Byzantium, 10th century. So making it somehow resemble some of these, but still retaining, first of all, what I would call the very new features of the story, the slow conversion and the desperate or the depressed teenager motif. And this, I believe, is a very important step in making additions to Greek literature. One thing I do say normally, even though I know some people disagree with me, is that Greek literature had a tendency not to include much foreign literature. In terms of the long history of Greek literature before the Fourth Crusade, because from there on, lots of things were translated into Greek. But before the Fourth Crusade, 1204, I would say you have the Septuagint, so the Old Testament, you have Syriac hagiography and hymnography, and you could also say perhaps you have Roman law, But apart from that, you don't have wholesale import of foreign literature into Greek literature, which is, of course, completely different from, say, Latin literature, where you have lots of Greek literature, Arabic literature, we have lots of, well, Greek and Persian literature, and so on. All other literatures you can mention have imports of a completely different dimension. Here is a very important import into Byzantine literature coming from Georgia, bringing Indian texts, but of course texts that had become well known in Georgian, in the Georgian sphere. And Efthymius did a good work. We have about 165 extant manuscripts of the Bahram and Yusuf story in Greek, and then of course there are all the numerous versions and manuscripts in Latin and Western vernaculars coming out of that also. This process of translation, I think, should be studied also in terms of its material side. I'm bringing up here the palm leaves up in the upper left corner, used in India for book production, where you have string palm leaves and read them in sequence by sort of turning or bringing the palm leaf as turning a page, but in these stringed, often also with double strings versions, where you could easily switch order of the stories. By the way, a feature I believe goes into perhaps the openness to reordering embedded tales or parts of any tale, perhaps much easier than was the case normally in Greek literature, at least. And I believe that this is part of the thing that you could say Efthymius contributed with, this idea of reordering more easily. But the whole idea that translators sit with one kind of some translator must have been sitting with one kind of material, and when translating, then producing the new text into another kind of material used in the source or the target literary sphere. So here I'm sort of showing the way from Indian palm leaves to, at the end, a Greek manuscript at the bottom left, right. So these are things that I believe were not included so much in this wonderful Georgian tradition of scholarly studies. I'm here bringing up Cornelia Kikilice, who was the modern present-day manuscript center in Tbilisi is named after him, and he was the one big scholar in the beginning of the 20th century who made so much old Georgian material available and known in publications in Georgian and in Russian especially, but other scholars have followed, and there's an enormous production on showing all these things. I have lots of Georgian scholars working on, for example, Efthymius, and especially showing the translations the other way into Georgian, and in many ways showing same types of characteristics. But I think we need to also expand the importance of Georgian, and like simply bringing up this kind of map and saying the Georgian played a central role in bringing things along into Greek literature. And some of these people who did that, and I think Efthymius is a wonderful case of that, did a very important work in we could say culturalizing, familiarizing things so that they could be well understood by a target audience in Byzantium and then further on west. So this is an idea about the interaction. In a sense, I believe I'm trying to argue for the other way, because so much Georgian scholarship, wonderful scholarship, has mainly been looking at how Georgians outside Georgia also, but also in Georgia, of course, but also outside, as the map I showed you, these translators was, of course, sitting not on the map I had with the mountains and the towns, were not sitting in Georgia, but they were producing for Georgia, but they were certainly also producing for others. So there was an interaction also with others and a great impact on other types of literature. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to the discussions and to your questions. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Kristian. This was really interesting and fascinating, and also in the context of this particular day, I think pointing at these very important, very ancient cultural connections and to Europe and influence in the European context, that is a really very important contribution. So thank you so